I'm Matt at Nexus Baseball, and this is episode 39 of the Tommy John Epidemic. This series is a YouTube read of content from the book Plague of the Gods, an outsider's perspective on baseball's Tommy John epidemic, which is available now on Amazon. I decided to put this content on YouTube to make the material as accessible as possible. This series examines the science behind the most superhuman action the human body can produce, accelerating a baseball up to 100 miles per hour. Having looked at the primary risk factors contributing to the Tommy John epidemic, the discussion becomes how baseball can make the necessary changes to mitigate future injuries. The principal component of any change will be a new model for pitcher training based on understanding the anatomy involved. In laying out this new anatomy-based model for pitching, it is critical to differentiate first between an overhand motion and an overhead motion. The two terms often become conflated when discussing pitching and pitching training. Overhead motions include shoulder press motions and resistance training, as well as sport motions like shooting a basketball. The safe pitching motion, by comparison, never brings the hand above the top of the head relative to the angle of the upper torso, or the elbow above shoulder height. This is where most of the confusion occurs, as most pitchers will often employ some degree of collateral tilt or torso bend at the waist when throwing the baseball overhand. This tilt arises from the need to get the hips forward, stay closed, and the desire to get on top of and pull down and through the baseball to create backspin for level flight. When looking at freeze frames of ball release in relation to the torso, almost all pitchers have the hand somewhere between the top of the head and directly to the side when releasing the ball. This is due to the muscles being used, particularly the serratus anterior working along this line of force. Likewise, the rotator cuff sees peak usage, with the minimum deltoid and upper trapezius engagement at this height and under light load. As the hands go overhead, and particularly as the load increases, these muscles are used more, and the potential speed of rotation decreases as the muscular support increases. This is important as humans can press and hold hundreds of pounds overhead, which would only be possible with these larger muscles as the primary movers and not the quick but relatively weak rotator cuff. Therefore, the pitching motion is much more akin to throwing a punch than throwing an axe overhead. The process is the same as a punch, except for the involvement of the rotator stretch component in the layback. In a punch, the serratus transfers the force of the hip rotation into the shoulder, but rather than releasing the deltoids to allow the arm to lay back, they flex, providing stability for impact and extension of the arm forward. The rotator cuff then fires, particularly the subscapularis, to turn the hand mid-flight from the up and down guarding position to the palm down punch position, resulting in the pronation seen at the end of a punch when shadowboxing. As in the pitching motion, the external rotators help decelerate the arm, and in boxing, snap it back to its starting position in front of the face for defense. Differences in hand speed are primarily dependent on the speed of the serratus activation and that of the subscapularis. Likewise, just like pitching, some boxers utilize their lats to pull the hand down into impact, particularly in punches like the overhand right or left, seen so commonly in MMA by heavily muscled strikers. The difference is the deltoid use and the lower hand speed make ligament stability much less of an issue. These differences were the greatest stumbling block in my transition from boxing and my adaptation to the pitching motion. Possessing strong lats and deltoids, I utilized these muscles heavily when punching. The power in the subscapularis and serratus was present as well, but was often overmatched by the larger muscles. When I threw with my deltoids and lat extensively. There was significant force generated, but not the ability to stretch the rotator cuff properly. In pitching, the harder I tried to throw, the greater the stability muscles would fire, slowing me down. By working extensively on the range of motion of my shoulders and understanding these differences, I was able to develop the correct stretch response and lay back and turn off these powerful stabilizers. Part of what held me back was not realizing how similar the punch and the pitching motions are. Although I knew both were rotational motions, I never heard the two motions described correctly enough to show their similarities. After researching pitching manuals extensively as part of my broader research, I found that renowned coach of the Atlanta Braves, Leo Mazzone, had described throwing the baseball like throwing a punch. When I read that comment in his pitching manual, I initially disregarded it before coming back to it after further research. What allowed the whole motion to click for me was watching Washington Nationals pitcher Max Scherzer at spring training in 2018. Both his sequencing in slow motion, as well as more importantly, watching him discuss his pitching motion with other Nationals pitchers. He demonstrated his motion to the other pitchers as a powerful palm-up punch that pronated at the end to palm down, almost like a karate punch at chest height. This mimicked the external rotators firing into the internal rotators at serratus drive perfectly, and is another strong example of activating a muscle activation chain with a specific cue. With this general understanding of the pitching motion, each portion can be broken down in greater detail, starting with the correct ground interactions. The lower half can generate a tremendous amount of force to be utilized in the pitching motion. The challenge is in transferring the force effectively up the kinetic chain. As discussed, the force required to accelerate the baseball is relatively small, and frequently pitchers try to overuse their legs, attempting to generate more velocity. What is required for maximum efficiency is enough use of the legs to generate the fastest possible rotation of the hips, while not over-rotating. Therefore, it is unnecessary to fly down the mound at maximum speed, but instead to retain balance into foot strike. To accomplish this, pitchers use either a wind-up, stretch, or slide step motion. The terminology in practice should not really matter, but instead provide a position where the front foot can land in a balanced fashion to allow the hips to turn fully to face the plate, while the core muscles maintain stability to allow the serratus to move. Although contrary to popular opinion of the past, throwing from the wind-up with the leg kick does not increase throwing velocity, but instead in many cases allows for better balance, cadence, and most importantly serratus function and stretch. That is not to say these cannot be accomplished by simply picking up and dropping the foot. One just must be that much more body aware to accomplish the same checkpoints. The challenge is to accomplish this as quickly as possible to thwart stealing with runners on base. For many pitchers, therefore, the stretch position is ideal. It allows for balance without significantly sacrificing speed. Likewise, it doesn't matter if the pitcher simply falls down the mound or attempts to push off the rubber for velocity, although it might for stride length. Logically, this makes sense as the pitcher is only moving a few miles an hour down the mound laterally and in a linear fashion, before stopping when the front foot lands. The pitcher must come to a stop before the rotational power of the hips can take effect. Join me for episode 40 next week. Remember, if you like the content, please like and subscribe. Your support makes this work possible. Also, if you want to jump ahead, please consider picking up the book on Amazon from the link in the description below. See you next week.